I'm Wendy from Shiny Happy World, and today I'm going to show you how to gather. I'm actually going to show you two different ways to gather. One is a slower and what I like to think of as the more old-fashioned way of gathering, and the other is a really great way to gather, but it requires a special foot for your sewing machine. So I'm doing this really small scale so that you'll be able to see the whole scope of the project. Basically what I want to do is join this piece of fabric to this. So I'm going to need to gather this piece up so that it'll fit in that space. So I'm going to take this over to the sewing machine. The first thing you're going to do is set your stitch length to the longest length possible. That's a basting stitch. And on my machine it's a number 6. It's different the way it's scaled for all the machines, but you want to get a very long stitch length. The other thing you're going to do that's a little different from what you normally do is do not backstitch at the beginning and end of your stitching. You do not want knots there. You want to be able to pull on those threads. So I'm going to do 2 lines of stitching with a very long stitch. So that's one line, and I'm going to pull it and make sure that I have enough tail to grab onto. So cut that off. And now I'm going to do one more line of stitching right next to this first one. You need to be careful not to cross over your lines of stitching because that'll kind of act like a knot. And the reason you're doing 2 rows of stitching is because sometimes when you're pulling together, one of your threads will break, and this way you don't have to start all over again. It's not totally necessary, but it's a good backup. And every single time I don't do 2 lines, my thread breaks. So now I always do 2. And again, I'm not back stitching at the end, just pulling it out and leaving myself a tail. And you can see I've got 2 rows of stitching there, very long stitches. Now we're going to go over and I'm going to show you how to gather it up so that you join them together. Okay, the first thing you need to do is do a few markings. You can see that I took this piece of fabric and I folded it in half and marked it with a pin. This is a small piece of fabric, so I don't need to do any more than that, but if it were bigger, you would fold it in half again and put a pin in that halfway point and keep doing that until you feel like you have manageable sections of fabric. So this one I've just got 1 pin in the middle. So I need to also divide this piece in half. So I'm going to fold it in half, just press it, open it back up, and mark that also with a pin. So this is divided in half and that's divided in half. If I divided this one in fourths, I would also want to divide this one in fourths. You want to divide both pieces of fabric into the same number of sections. And then what you're going to do is grab the 2 bottom threads here. Just leave the top ones alone and grab the bottom threads and hold on to both of them. If you hold on to them, you can pull the fabric up and gather it on those threads. And you can do the same thing from the other side. You can gather it all in one direction or gather it in both directions. For a short piece I would usually gather it all in one direction, but if you have a really long piece it helps to gather it up from both directions. And I usually gather it up actually more than it needs to be. That helps me to even things out to start with. And now I join the 2 pieces together. Right sides together. The first thing I'm going to do is pin both centers so that the centers are matched up. And now I'm actually going to ungather a little bit so that the edges match up. So now I've got this edge matched up. I'm going to pin that. I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. I'm going to ungather it just a little bit so that this edge matches up, and I'm going to pin that. And now I've got my fabrics the same length, but you can see that I've got my stitches, my gathering is uneven. So the last step before I take it back to the sewing machine is just to even those gathers out. I'm just going to do that on both of them, and you just pull it, the fabric will slide right on those threads. So now I've got that pretty well evened out. I'm going to take it back to the sewing machine and sew those layers together. When I sew the layers together, I like to have my gathers on top and my flat fabric on bottom. That way I can watch the gathers and make sure that they are gathering evenly and staying even and not getting kind of slanty or anything. So now I am going to backstitch at the beginning. And now go forward, take out my pin, and now I need to stop and just make sure I've got everything lined up here. Make sure my gathers are all laying straight. They can tend to slant this way a little bit as you sew, so make sure they're all straight and hold them down while you sew. And get to the second pin, take it out, and again get everything all laid out nice and straight. Take that pin out and do a little back stitching. One thing I didn't mention was seam allowance. You want to make sure to do your gathering stitches in your seam allowance. Normally when you're doing clothing you're going to have a 5/8 inch seam allowance, so it's safe to do your gathering stitches at about 1/4 of an inch in, and you just want to make sure that all those messy gathering stitches end up in the seam allowance part that's never going to be seen. So now let me open it up and you can see that you have nice even gathers on there. The other way to gather uses a special foot called a gathering foot. I'm going to pop my regular presser foot off and pop on my gathering foot. Before I put that on, let me show this to you. This has got a special slot in there. This is so that you can put the fabric that you want to gather. It runs under the foot, and if you want to sew it to another piece of fabric, you can slide that through this foot and it won't get gathered. I don't usually use that feature. I like to gather it in one step and then sew them together with a regular presser foot, but that's what that little slot there is for. So now I'm going to put it on the machine. That's on. And let me show you how this works. It's pretty magical. I'm going to do 2 strips for you. I cut these strips 10 inches long, and I'll explain why in just a minute. For right now I'm going to show you the gathering foot with a regular stitch length. The stitch length affects how much gather there is. So you can see with a regular stitch length I get very little gather. I'm going to bump it all the way up to a 6 now so that you can really see the difference that you get. So that is gathered up with a 6, and you can see that that is a lot more roughly. Now the question is, how do you control the length that you're getting, your final length that you're ending up with? That involves math, and I'm going to do that in written form with a blog post to go with this video, because I think if I do it on the video I'm just going to be saying numbers and it's not going to make any sense. I'd rather do that so that I'm going to show you the actual chart that I use, but it will explain why I use a 10-inch strip. It makes the math a lot easier. So that's how you gather. I showed you 2 ways. One is a little more labor intensive. It involves doing 2 rows of basting stitches and very carefully pulling on those threads. It was really easy with the small piece that I did here, but if you were doing a super ruffly skirt with very, very long gathers, it's not fun to do that. The second way I showed you uses a gathering foot, which is a great investment. I don't usually buy a lot of fancy feet for my machine, but this is one that I bought about 5 years ago and I've used it a million times since then. It's not one of the really expensive feet. I think it only cost me about $18 and it is worth every penny of that. The only thing that's tricky about it is knowing exactly how much you're going to shrink something up. With the draw, the basting strings and gather, it's very easy to control and get it to match exactly the length that you want. With the gathering foot, you actually have to do a little bit of math, and I'm going to outline that and show you how I do that in the blog post that goes with this video. I'm Wendy from Shiny Happy World. I'll see you next time.